it brings us to the topic of specialty that brings you here, which is about sport and cricket in Zimbabwe. It's interesting you speak of cricket as being crucial to the reproduction of whiteness in Zimbabwe. In many ways, that's the case here in South Africa, especially the more traditional, I guess, English sports, cricket being one, rugby being the other. How did you get drawn not just into cricket, but into Trevor Madondo, who is a Black cricketer? You wrote the superb essay for Africa as a Country, The Life and Times of Trevor Madondo. What was it about his story that enticed you?
Well, perhaps if I can start by telling you how I got into cricket itself. For that as well, I must thank my parents and especially my father, who introduced me to the game. And further to that, really sparked my own education in what cricket could be. One of the first cricket books my parents ever got me was C.L.R. James' Beyond the Boundary. So that was and remains my one of my aspirations. I mean, I don't want to compare myself to C.L.R. James in any way, but it's certainly something to aspire to. The way he wrote about cricket, the way C.L.R. James understood cricket as part of history and society, and also as a mode of apprehending these things and apprehending the lives of people within this sport, within this system. And then to go to Trevor's story, Trevor Madondo is someone who most people, all people who are Zimbabwean and have been following cricket for any amount of time will have known of Trevor and will have known of his story. I certainly knew of the Trevor Madondo story growing up. But I always felt that that his story had not fully been told. That Trevor Madondo was known as this somewhat wild character, a talented cricketer who never made the most of his talent and unfortunately died young. But there's really so much more to it than that. There's a complex human being there with his own story, who lived through some amazing times in his country's history, some rapid changes, and was a forerunner of many things. So this grounding in the work of C.L.R. James and understanding cricket as not just a sport, as an art, but also as a dramatic spectacle, as part of the institutions of society, as part of the fabric of society. All these things kind of come together in Trevor's story. One of my main goals in writing that story was to really allow that complexity to shine through, to not make Trevor an example of something, or to allow him to his story to speak for itself, the good, the bad, the complicated, the successes, the challenges, and as part of telling that story, to be able to tell a story about my country, and Trevor's country, and the times that he lived in, and what he achieved outside of cricket.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there. I always kick myself that I haven't read C.L.R. James's book.
It's never too late.
It's never too late indeed. I mean, a friend recommended it to me recently as a way to try and seduce me into loving the sport. I have a long-standing gripe against cricket purely because when I began high school, I moved from a primary school where football was dominant sport, went to a high school where cricket and rugby were dominant sports, and just felt like I had to resist being assimilated into that culture. But I suppose what you said there about using Madondo's story and cricket to tell the story of Zimbabwe, what does cricket mean in Zimbabwe? We've already answered some of that in terms of how it's a way of reproducing whiteness. But what else does it mean in Zimbabwe? At least in South Africa, sport is supposed to, as everywhere, sport is this great unifier. And when this nation was in its birth pangs, before it was in its birth pangs, when it was a different nation and altogether, what did cricket mean, and how can we understand Zimbabwe through cricket?
Well, I guess the Zimbabwean cricket story, part of it is where we have come from in the past, and it's important to acknowledge that and to understand the past. But at the same time, the past is fixed, but the present and the future are in our hands. So that's really what interests me. Cricket obviously has a long history in Zimbabwe and in Rhodesia. That's not so much what interests me. What interests me is what cricket is doing now in that society, and where cricket now is in Zimbabwe. We mentioned earlier sport and cricket in Zimbabwe as a way of reproducing forms of identity and white identity, and even that white identity doesn't mean the same thing now as it did 40 years ago, 20 years ago. So when we talk of cricket in Zimbabwe, and you mentioned South Africa as well, I think I'm not sure if this is controversial to say so, but I think in many ways Zimbabwean cricket is ahead of South African cricket. In terms of the way that the game has developed and become a national sport and a sport for everyone. These changes are coming to South Africa, but even within the South African team, you might have players of different colors coming into the team now, but overwhelmingly the South African squad comes from elite schools in South Africa. In Zimbabwe, that's not the case. Sure, those schools also exist in Zimbabwe, but cricket has moved out of those boundaries there. The strongest cricketing schools in Zimbabwe are not necessarily the richest schools, and cricket's audience and cricket's people in Zimbabwe are not what they once were. I've been going to Harare Sports Club now to watch cricket for almost 30 years, and it's throughout that time period, cricket has changed. It has been adapted. It has been contested. It has been appropriated in a good way into something quite different. So when we talk of what cricket means in Zimbabwe, I really try not to get too caught up in cricket's colonial past. Although, yeah, again, I say we have to acknowledge that is part of it, but not to get stuck in it, because it's so much more dynamic than that. And cricket has come to mean so much more to so many other people. Even the space of cricket itself, the cricket grounds. I mentioned that I'd been going to Harare Sports Club for almost 30 years. And you look at a cricket ground, even that cricket ground in particular is colonial architecture. It was part of the Salisbury as it was. It was part of the colonial infrastructure, but that very infrastructure became the site at which colonialism was dismantled. This infrastructure and these sites of control and oppression are the very sites where these things can be challenged, and that's why cricket is so interesting to me, because it's obviously this has this reputation of being a staid, kind of boring English sport that was spread through colonialism, and obviously that's true, but it's burst out of those boundaries, and in the very act of being used for those things provided the space for challenging colonialism, for challenging the oppression. And even within cricket, people talk of this thing, the spirit of cricket, these ethics, the ideas of fairness, fair play, meritocracy, and things like that. And when the sport in its past has failed to live up to these ideals, and this is something CLR James knew very well, that becomes the very way to attack these structures, to interrogate them and to turn them into something quite different to what they once were. And that's certainly the case in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwean cricket is, in many ways, unrecognizable from the thing it was at independence.
That's fascinating, and I think it speaks to the underlying sort of universalist character of sport, insofar as it is anything that anyone can claim ownership over. And in many ways, the story of Trevor Madondo that you told was of this young lad who felt he had ownership of this game, insofar as he didn't need to fulfill any expectation that anyone had of him, how he ought to play the game, how he ought to have his career unfold. He was going to do it at his own way, at his own pace, for better or worse. You're very clear to mention that part of the bad that happens in his life is out of his own agency. But the important part of that is that he has agency to live out his career in the way that he wants to, and is responsible for both the good and the bad. And in many ways, that is the way in which, through his individual life, he does a lot to undo the colonial kind of baggage of a game like cricket.
Yeah, and there's so much going on in Trevor's story. That's the other thing that attracted it to me. It's there's questions of race, questions of masculinity and representations of masculinity. Even the role of alcohol and alcohol abuse in Zimbabwean society across the board. And yeah, as you mentioned, Trevor's story is, he did it his own way. And it's a beautiful story, but also quite a tragic story in many ways. And that, for me, makes it all the more a Zimbabwean story, a uniquely Zimbabwean story, and one that definitely needed to be told.